All right, so we're going to start the Amanpour webcast right now with Professor Simon Schama, who's just done an interview with Christian and is now here in the Amanpour newsroom. Our users submitted questions on Facebook and Twitter and on our blog. The first question I want to put to you is from Missile Fridge, and she says, is there any sense of nationalism in Afghanistan at the moment?
Oh, I'm sure there's an enormous sort of feeling of pain and indignity, really, about, there always has been in Afghan history about the presence of foreign occupiers. There's this tortured sort of split personality. On the one hand, Afghans want to run their own country. It's always been the case, even when their governments have been open to Western influences. On the other hand, you know, the history of war in the 20th century is so tortured that, as Karzai said in the interview, they have to accept sometimes help from the outside. The real deep issue, which doesn't get as much coverage maybe as it should, is Pashtun nationalism. Mm-hmm. That was very important. It was important all through the period of the Emirates and the kingdom in the 20th century. It was always a problem for Western governments, Westernizing governments, which there were many just after the First World War, again late in the 1920s, to manage to Pashtunize a sort of openness to the secular world of the West. They were always facing upheavals among the Pashtun. The Brits, of course, scoundrels that we are, divided Pashtuns between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And that's, of course, you know, these seams are very ragged, but alienated Pashtuns who are less interested in the kind of hardcore Islamic fundamentalism than they are in saying, we actually, in some sense, are at the heart of Afghan sovereignty on both sides of the border. You have to suppose that they constitute most of the Taliban right now. And the issue for Karzai is, can you somehow co-opt those who are not really part of a kind of al-Qaeda madness of militant Islamic fundamentalism, but are really just angry Pashtun nationalists? Those are the people you've got to co-opt.
Our next question is from Bookman Jack. And he wants to know, does the rest of the world now see this new change in strategy as just an occupation? So outside of the United States, other countries, is this just an occupation to them?
Well, I think the default knee-jerk liberal, I'm a default knee-jerk liberal, but I think actually that view, my friends in London, I think, almost certainly do see it that way. But the reason they do is that not enough is said, actually, about what the nature of the enemy is. The extraordinary thing about Afghanistan is they've had experience of how horrible and dictatorial and brutal the Taliban regime was, whether it was less corrupt than the Karzai government delivering basic services. In some respects, it may have been. But you have to really say, what would happen if, you know, Western presence, troop presence, NATO and the United States, went away and simply we ceded, really, or Afghanistan then became a Taliban restoration? The answer, if you look at the education of women, what is the enemy in Afghanistan? What is the demon? Answer, an educated woman. Once you say that to my knee-jerk liberal default friends, you've got a very different answer.
So two of our users will follow up right on that. C.B. Webster and Michael Supp both want to know about women in Afghanistan. Interested in hearing what Simon has to say about the future of women in business and education in Afghanistan. And the other question was, will there be social programs as part of this new surge to help women?
Well, let me take the second one first. If there aren't, then, you know, there's no hope. I mean, despite the kind of allergic response of Robert Gibbs and actually it was General McChrystal who said, we are not doing nation building. Of course we are. As you know, Hamid Karzai himself in the interview said, well, if you don't, what's the point, actually? So what's the point of a civilian surge? We do, it's just a sort of dirty word. It's ridiculous. The Obamanics are so frightened of Republicans saying, well, the nation we've got to build is our own. So they preempt that kind of, you know, hard view.
So you think there will be social programs to help women as part of this?
If they're not, they need money. And, as Christian said at the end of the programme, it's absolutely crucial for effective delivery of money, which has simply got missing. Now, the women issue, again, a little bit of history. Two successive governments earlier in the 20th century, Abdul Rahman and then Amanullah Khan, particularly in the 1920s, made amazing strides, were against the burqa, opened education, both primary education and higher education, to women. Afghanistan was a kind of model, actually, for the possibility of having an Islamic culture, which at the same time was open to the modernizing forces of the West. So, there's something to build on, really, there.
Okay, Eduardo from Qatar wants to know why only NATO and U.S. fighting in Afghanistan, whereas Asia, the Persian Gulf countries, etc. What are they doing, if anything, or why aren't they doing anything?
Well, because actually, when one thinks about Persian Gulf, they're terrified, actually, that in the event of a Taliban restoration, there'll be a kind of arc of Islamic fundamentalism, which will have knock-on effect in the Gulf itself. That's why there were no Saudi. It would be wonderful if there were Saudi troops in Afghanistan, but they don't want to be put in a position where they're seen to be an instrument of the Kafirs, of the sort of infidels.
Politically or economically? Or
politically, I think, really. It's a political and, religious issue for them, really. And they're waiting to see what will happen to Pakistan, They're waiting... in some sense, of course, the division of Pakistan into an urban democratic Pakistan and a hived-off, virtually sort of Taliban-run West Pakistan is a sort of utter nightmare scenario, and they're just sort of waiting to see what happens there, I believe.
Okay, one last question from Fibonacci. Why should coalition not buy total Afghan poppy production?
No reason at all. I think. At least I think it's now an administration policy to abandon the destruction of poppy crops, really. Is he thinking of putting the price down, on the streets? I don't know. It'd be a solution, I think. It's probably have to wait just a second more to get hold of the stuff.
Perfect. Professor Schama, thank you so much for taking our web questions.